All right, let's get right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking the life and legacy of one of the absolute most unpredictable, dramatic, and frankly fascinating figures in modern Middle Eastern history, Anwar el-Sadat. If you think you know political plot twists, well, buckle up, because the source material we're analyzing today maps out a life that reads literally like a high-stakes geopolitical thriller. We're going to break down exactly how this single man reshaped alliances, redrew maps, and sparked consequences that are no jokes still vibrating across the globe today.
Now, you might be wondering, how is a guy like this actually remembered? And what's really interesting here is the sheer polarity of the question we have to ask: hero or traitor? According to our source, Sadat's legacy is essentially split straight down the middle. To truly understand him, we have to look at how he's viewed through two completely opposite lenses. He is a man who totally defies simple categorization. And honestly, that contradiction is the absolute core of our explainer today.
So on one hand, the Western world and his supporters hailed him as an ambassador of peace, the visionary leader who bravely ended decades of relentless, grueling wars in the region. But then, on the flip side, to his critics and to much of the Arab world at the time, he was branded a traitor to Palestine. The very same actions that won him a Nobel Peace Prize were condemned as a total abandonment of the Palestinian cause. You really can't grasp the Sadat story without holding both of these opposing truths in your head at the exact same time.
To see how this all builds up, let's anchor on a really crucial moment from the source, the 1974 Islamic Summit in Lahore. Just picture the scene for a second. Sadat is standing tall, shoulder to shoulder with absolute titans of the Islamic world, like Saudi Arabia's Shah Faisal and Pakistan's Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. The source emphasizes this as the absolute peak of his popularity. I mean, he was the undisputed hero of the Arab world at this exact second. I want you to keep this image of unified, overwhelming support in your mind, because what makes his story so incredibly dramatic is just how spectacularly and how quickly all of this would shatter. But hey, before we get to the fall, we have to understand the ascent. How did a guy from a poor farming village rise to command the absolute center of the world stage?
Section 1. The Unexpected Rise, From Shadows to Power.
To really understand his ascent, we have to look at the theme of underestimation. As our source notes, Sadat's political journey started in the military. Back in 1952, he was part of the Young Officers, alongside Gamal Abdel Nasser, who overthrew King Farouk. But here is the kicker. For decades, Sadat was always viewed as a secondary, kind of weak figure, just a background character. So when the legendary Nasser suddenly died in September 1970, the political elites thought they'd struck gold. They maneuvered Sadat into the presidency, fully expecting him to be this weak puppet they could just control from the shadows. Well, they made a massive historic miscalculation. Within mere months, this supposed weak man ruthlessly eliminated his rivals, sidelined his opponents, and consolidated control to become the single most powerful man in Egypt. Once his power was secure, though, Sadat realized he needed a totally new foundation to keep it. He couldn't just rely on the military, and that brings us to a massive strategic shift.
Section 2. The Believer President, Religion and State.
He actually adopted the title Al-Rais El-Mumin, which translates to the Believer President. And this wasn't just some catchy nickname. The source explicitly details how this was a highly calculated political message. Sadat was actively rebranding. He was stepping away from the strictly secular nationalism of his predecessor and deliberately presenting himself to the public not just as a politician or a general, but as a deeply faithful religious leader. He was essentially intertwining his personal faith with the ultimate authority of the state.
Let's compare exactly how that shift worked in practice. Under Nasser, religious institutions were tightly suppressed, but Sadat, he completely flipped the script. He struck this tactical alliance with the highly influential Al-Azhar University. Now, why do that? Well, he needed them. He empowered these religious scholars to help him counter the rising domestic leftists and to justify his impending break from the Soviet bloc. By giving religion a seat at the table of state power, he gained immense, immediate legitimacy. But, as the source astutely warns, this was a massive double-edged sword. When you bring religion into state power to support you, you are inherently inviting religious accountability for your future actions. And those future actions, they'd prove to be some of the most controversial in history. Get ready, because the geopolitical maneuvers we're about to look at will literally give you whiplash.
Section 3. Pivot to Peace, a Geopolitical Shift.
Sadat's geopolitical maneuvers were just incredibly unpredictable. Just trace these steps with me for a second. 1970, he takes power. Egypt is a staunch ally of the Soviet Union. Then, totally out of nowhere in 1972, he abruptly expels thousands of Soviet advisors. Moscow is furious, Washington is stunned. Then, 1973, the Yom Kippur War. He orders his military to cross the Suez Canal, shocking Israel and instantly transforming himself into an absolute Arab war hero. But Sadat knows Egypt's economy just cannot survive endless wars. He wants a victory at the negotiating table. So, in 1977, he does the unthinkable. He boards a plane to Jerusalem and speaks directly to the Israeli parliament. It was as if this impossible wall had just evaporated overnight. And that bold move culminated in 1978 with the signing of the Camp David Accords. In just 8 years, he went from a Soviet client to an Arab war hero to shaking hands with the Israeli Prime Minister on the White House lawn.
But we have to ask, what was the actual cost of that handshake? The Camp David trade-off had profound consequences. On the side of gains, Egypt gets the entire Sinai Peninsula returned to them, and the floodgates of American financial and military aid swing wide open. It's a massive win for Egypt's borders and their bank accounts. But on the side of losses, the source notes that the blowback was immediate and it was devastating. Egypt, the historic heart of the Arab world, was unceremoniously kicked out of the Arab League. Diplomatic ties were completely severed. Sadat achieved peace with his neighbor, sure, but it resulted in complete, crushing isolation from his Arab brethren.
And back home, the pressure cooker was whistling. That religious legitimacy he'd so carefully built with Al-Azhar University was totally fracturing. The scholars, the public, the political factions, they were all deeply, deeply uneasy about this peace with Israel. And this brings us to the turning tide in 1981. Sensing this immense, multifaceted anger brewing against him from Islamists, leftists, and nationalists alike, Sadat made a fatal miscalculation. He ordered the mass arrests of thousands of domestic opponents. He genuinely believed that by rounding up his critics, he was securing his rule. He thought the danger was neutralized. Actually, scratch that. He couldn't have been more wrong. The danger was already inside the house, which brings us to the dramatic and tragic climax of his life.
Section 4. The Assassination. October 6, 1981. The sequence of events here is steeped in a really dark, bitter irony. On October 6, 1981, Sadat is sitting at a military victory parade. He's smiling, celebrating the very day of his triumphant 1973 Suez crossing that made him a hero in the first place. As the troops roll by, a military vehicle abruptly breaks formation. It stops directly in front of the presidential reviewing stand. A young officer, Lieutenant Khalid Islambouli, steps out. In seconds, absolute chaos erupts. Gunfire, smoke, panic. Anwar el-Sadat is assassinated right there in his chair. The tragic irony the source highlights is profound. The very military establishment that had elevated him to absolute power, the one that gave him his hero status, was the exact instrument that ended his life. But the story definitely doesn't end on that parade ground. In fact, our source argues that the true impact of this event is literally still unfolding today.
Section 5. The global ripple effect. Decades of consequences. Now, it's incredibly important to understand that the assassin, Lieutenant Islambouli, wasn't just some lone wolf. The source explicitly maps out how he was the product of a highly volatile political and ideological climate brewing in the 1970s and 80s, a time where state power violently clashed with religious movements. Neutrally mapping out the source's analysis here, we see what's basically an ideological chain reaction. The friction between Sadat's state and religious institutions fueled the intellectual resistance of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. That resistance eventually bled into the global networks that were forged during the Afghan Jihad. From those networks, the source traces a direct, really complex lineage to the rise of al-Qaeda and subsequently to the emergence of modern extremist groups like Boko Haram and ISIS. The assassination wasn't just an isolated event. It became a catalyst, a starting gun for a new, deeply complex era of militant networks and huge global consequences.
And that leaves us with this final, incredibly thought-provoking question drawn directly from our source material. As we look at the immense fallout of Sadat's life and death, did internal chaos and ideological fractures alone shape this explosive era? Or did external conspiracies and foreign interventions fan the flames to serve their own geopolitical interests? It is a giant puzzle of statecraft, religion, and power that history is honestly still trying to untangle. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the history you think you know, and I'll see you next time.